Again, in Nizhny-Chirskaya, a radiogram from the boiler was received. It concerned me personally. General Paulus urgently demanded that I come. I decided to immediately fulfill Paulus's order. I asked on the phone the command of Army Group Don to change me. At first there was a refusal. Only after the Army commander justified to the Army Group Command the necessity of my presence in Gumrak, it was agreed, provided that one of the division commanders who had been freed in the cauldron would be appointed as my successor. The Army commander agreed. With a heavy heart, I said goodbye to my battle group. For 2 weeks of fighting together, I won the trust of officers and soldiers. Would they understand me if I surrendered command just now, when the situation at the mouth of the Chir is increasingly aggravated and there are important decisions to be made? Captain Goebel assured me that they were all very reluctant to part with me, but no one would think that I was abandoning my soldiers to their fate at a difficult moment, for I was not going to a safe rear, but to an unknown future in the cauldron. In this unknown, I was fully aware of myself. Maybe it would not be possible to slip out of the steel ring between the Don and the Volga. On December 10th, Lieutenant General Baron von Gablenz, commander of the 384th Infantry Division, arrived at Nizhny-Chirskaya with his staff. We were well acquainted. Gablenz was a friend of Paulus and often visited our headquarters. "I was instructed to give you greetings from General Paulus," said Gablenz. "He thanks you for your work on the Chira front, but now the 6th Army again needs his first adjutant. Therefore, Adam, I must replace you here." "That's excellent, but what happened to your division, Mr. General?" "Yes, that's right. You don't know what happened in the cauldron after November 22nd. I really don't know where to begin. So, on November 23rd, the enemy pressed us so hard that the Army Command decided to withdraw to the east beyond the Don Fortiv Tank Corps and Iuosi Army Corps to prevent the threat of their destruction. My division was ordered to create a bridgehead west of the Don to cover the crossings at Perepolnoye and Akimovskoye. It was necessary to defend the positions until both corps crossed the Don. It was a fierce, bloody battle. When in the evening of November 24th we reached the eastern bank of the Don, there was little left of my division. We were put on the western section of the defence, but our combat effectiveness was reduced to almost zero. So General Paulus decided to disband the division. The surviving officers and soldiers were distributed to other infantry divisions. A little better fate, 376th Infantry Division, which on the east bank of the Don covered us from the rear. It is true that it still exists, but its strength is hardly more than that of a single regiment. As a result of the rapid advance of the Russians, the divisions of the 10th Army Corps had lost all their rear services, together with stores of food, ammunition, and uniforms. My intendant reported to me that into the hands of the enemy had fallen most of the depots entirely. It was not possible to distribute in advance even those small batches of winter uniforms that arrived earlier. The boiler has reduced the norms of allowances. But I don't want to frighten you. You'll soon see for yourself. In addition to the 384th, were other divisions disbanded, Mr. General? Yes, the 94th Infantry Division, which was also destroyed during the escape. The 79th Infantry Division suffered such serious losses that it too will probably be disbanded in the coming days, as Paulus told me. The commander of the 94th Infantry Division is to fly out of the cauldron to collect the returning 6th Army furloughed men. The transfer of battle groups was made quickly, without any delay. After I gave an overview of the situation and characterized the condition of the troops, we left for the commanders. I took this opportunity to bid them farewell and thank them for their selfless actions. The next day the car took me to the department of the 6th Army Oberquartermeister in Morozovsk. Here was located the headquarters of the 3rd Romanian Army, to which my battle group had been subordinate for the last few days. When I reported my arrival, the commander, Colonel General Dumitrescu, invited me to dinner. There I met, along with the Romanian Chief of Staff and the German Chief of Staff, Colonel Wenck. I learned from him that north of Morozovsk the whole front had come into motion. Reinforcements, which we transferred, with difficulty manages to close the gaps formed. The heavy worries of the past 3 weeks and the seriousness of the situation prevented the officers sitting at the table from having a lively conversation. Only from time to time the table neighbours exchanged words. In general, there was a gloomy silence. There were unspoken questions on everyone's lips. What new disturbing news would come in the next few hours? How long would we stay in Morozovsk? When will Hollitz's deblocking army be formed? In the afternoon I returned to the Oberquartermeister's department, hoping that I would still see my old comrades and co-workers before the flight to the cauldron. Unfortunately, I did not catch my friend Colonel Zele. He, too, took a combat group on the Chira near Surovikin. The few acquaintances I met apparently felt sorry for me. That made me angry. Of course, there was nothing pleasant about flying back to the boiler, but in a difficult situation, every officer must be with his unit. It was for me the 6th Army, which was surrounded. In the afternoon, I met our Oberquartermeister, Colonel Bader. Only a few days ago, Paulus had sent him from the cauldron to ensure from the outside a better and more systematic supply of the army. The colonel handed me a telegram from Major General Schmidt, in which he asked me to send 3 regimental commanders to the boiler. This seemed a little strange to me. After all, Lieutenant General von Gablenz told me about the disbandment of 2 infantry divisions. Were there not enough commanders there? Out of caution, I sent a corresponding request to the Army Command. The answer came immediately. 3 regimental commanders should fly into the cauldron. It was not difficult to do. In Morozovsk, there was an officer reserve. Here, 3 senior officers were selected. The next day, they were to fly to Gumrak. When this matter was settled, I was able to talk to the Oberquartermeister about some supply problems. In what way, exactly, is the army supplied, Bader? By air. A supply base has been set up here in Morozovsk. Every day, as far as the weather permits, cars with food, ammunition, fuel, medicines, bandages fly continuously to the boiler. They bring back the severely wounded. And you'll also land tomorrow at the big airfield at Nursery. There are several fighters stationed there to escort transport planes. I don't understand that. There are about 330,000 men on the army payroll. Can they all be supplied by air? Now, the number is no longer so great, although the army also included 3 divisions of the 4th Panzer Army and 2 Romanian divisions that were surrounded. According to yesterday's reports, in the cauldron is now on the allowance of only 270,000 people. But even for this number is far from enough airlifted food. The army is receiving only a fraction of its minimum requirement. To put it bluntly, it's a big pig, and Goering is primarily to blame. He, apparently as always, boasted, assured Hitler that the Air Force will fully ensure the supply of material supplies to the army. According to our calculations, for the normal supply of the army need daily at least 700 tons of cargo. In order to some extent to maintain the fighting ability of the army, it is necessary to transfer at least 500 tons. Consequently, at least 250 Junkers 52s with a payload of 2 tons each would have to fly daily. It was never possible to realize this. The result was an ever-increasing shortage of food, ammunition, fuel 52 was. Add to this that of the encircled divisions, 8 lost their warehouses and rear units. To supply them, of course, we also lack transport means. Meanwhile, it is these divisions, which are unlikely to have winter clothing, had to occupy the new southern and western sections of the defence, where there were no trenches or shelters. The army is waiting for the heaviest disaster. The mass of people will die of starvation, freezing, if the ground connection with the cauldron is not restored as soon as possible. Tell me, Bader, why the army immediately, in the first days, did not break through the still weak ring of encirclement and did not break through to the southwest. Of course, it would not have been without casualties, but the main forces would have been saved. I only know one thing. Army Commander repeatedly asked for permission to break through the encirclement, but Hitler each time rejected these proposals. Paulus will probably tell you more about it. So you think it impossible that the army for a long time to be supplied by air? I repeat again that such an idea can only arise in the mind of a fantasist. My staff is of the same opinion, and all of them have a great deal of experience in this field, replied the colonel. May I communicate your opinion to General Paulus? Of course. It was past midnight, and I was still thrashing about the room assigned to me for the night. For all my sense of duty, which even then I had not yet lost, I felt uneasy when I thought of the fact that not a day would pass before I would be in that bloody furnace. And even outside the cauldron our situation was not much better. In front of our dismembered front west of the Don stood strong, well-armed and equipped Soviet armies, ready for further fighting. For a number of days they had been attacking our battle groups and the 3rd Romanian Army. Nor could I consider that the deployment of our new army at Kotelnikov under Colonel General Gotha had gone unnoticed by the Soviet command. The Soviet command must have concentrated large forces in the steppes between the Don and the Volga. And our front on the Lower Chir? How long will it hold out? The 11th Panzer Division and the 336th Infantry Division were badly exhausted and are using all their strength to repel enemy attacks. From them cannot be expected to support the army of Gotha 53. But what good is all this thinking? After all, the next morning should finally come out tanks Gotha, and after them should be followed by echelons with materiel for the 6th Army. Before going to bed, I called the airfield in Morozovsk. The commandant was at the telephone. Well, has it already been decided at what time I fly tomorrow? I asked. The first 3 cars start at 4 o'clock. They fly 2 of the requested regimental commanders. You will go on one of the next 3 cars, which will leave around 8 o'clock. But the situation may compel an urgent change in the time of departure. Therefore, it would be advisable for you to arrive by 7 o'clock. I promised to be exact. The next day, December 12th, there was a heavy frost. The morning twilight had not yet dissipated when I arrived at the airfield at 7 o'clock. The commandant waited anxiously for the return of the cars, which had left for the fleet at 4 a.m. Finally, when it was already down, one of the cars landed. Where had the other 2 gone? The pilot reported that shortly after the boiler was left behind, all 3 planes came under heavy flak fire. Probably the 2 U-52s that did not return were shot down. A bad omen for me and the 3rd Regimental Commander who was to fly with me. After parting with the commandant, we hurried to the 3 Heinkel 101s ready for launch. Through the bags and boxes of food, I snuck into the seat behind the pilot, next to the radio operator. Immediately after the start, the machines gained altitude sharply. Soon the altimeter showed 4,000 meters. Only then we flew eastward. We crossed the Don much to the south of Nizhne-Chirskaya. Below us, the Kalmyk steppes sparkled in the sunlight. Above us, the cloudless blue sky shone cheerfully. I remembered my first flight in summer, also in clear weather, when I flew to Vinitsa. And then I was looking for Soviet fighters in the sky. But then there were German Messerschmitts in the air. Now there was no fighter cover of their own. The sky was open to Soviet Yaks. What should I do if enemy fighters attack us? I shouted in the pilot's ear. He grinned. Continue to sit still, Mr. Colonel. We will do everything ourselves, he replied, trying to shout over the hum of the engines. The guy made me a little angry. After all, I didn't have a parachute. And in case of a hit? I yelled again. Then we'll be expended, he answered on the same note, but with the same calmness, as if he were talking about the most ordinary things. He pointed his finger downward. That's where the Red Army positions are. In one of the villages I noticed vehicles. Tanks, Mr. Colonel. Like a guide accompanying travellers, he commented on everything that came into view. Clouds like wads of absorbent cotton, then closer, then a little farther away, then above us, then below us, testified that anti-aircraft guns opened fire on us. But my cicerone was not deterred by this. He continued his thunderous chatter. Did he not want to help me overcome my ill feeling and even fear? I admired this young officer, for he had travelled the path of death several times every day. But now he turned his shining face toward me. The deed is done, Mr. Colonel. The kennel is beneath us. Truly, a stone fell from my heart. It's a damn nasty feeling to be a helpless target for enemy shells without being able to take cover, let alone defend oneself. The airplane went into a descent, made many circles over the airfield. Even at the first glance down, I immediately realized what was going on here. The area was strewn with wrecked airplanes and cars. Here, Condor. There, Fokker-Wulf. In another place, the remains of several Junkers 52 and Heinkel 111. The work of Red bombers and fighters. Both other machines landed almost at the same time as ours. My pilot, who had epitomized calmness itself on the road, now pressed on with the unloading. The supplies were hastily unloaded. Then came the return cargo, the wounded crawling out of earth holes, waddling to the airplane or brought on stretchers. An officer and a few soldiers, apparently field gendarmerie, held back the pressure of the dense crowd. Only those who had a certificate from the Chief of the Army Sanitary Service could fly out. Alarm! A shrill howl rang out in the midst of the confusion. Soviet bombers. Soviet bombers. At that moment everyone thought of the danger that threatened him and sought shelter wherever they could. I went straight to the airfield commandant's shelter. The ground shook. The thick timbers shook. The earth fell between the timbers of the wooden ceiling right on the table in front of us. A few dozen bursts, then apparently it was over. "You don't have much fun here," I said to an Air Force lieutenant from the airfield commandant's headquarters. "Do you often get such visits?" "We're used to it, Mr. Colonel. Ivan doesn't bomb us every day without a break. If there are no casualties, it doesn't bother us so much." Before the pilot could finish his sentence, there were cries for help. "Orderlies! Orderlies!" "Are there any doctors here?" I asked worriedly. At the very edge of the airfield are large tents of the sanitary service. By order of the Army Command, all the seriously wounded are transported here so that they can be flown out in vehicles delivering supplies. The Army Physician Major General of the Medical Service, Professor Dr. Rinaldi, is here. He is in charge of dispatching the wounded. In fact, he is powerless to restore order, as many lightly wounded are also reaching here. They are hiding in empty trenches and bunkers. As soon as a vehicle lands, they are the first to be on the ground. Ruthlessly, they push away the seriously wounded. Some manage, despite the gendarmes, to slip into the plane. Often we have to clear the plane again to make room for the seriously wounded. It takes the brush of Bruegel, nicknamed the Painter of Hell, or the power of Dante's words to describe the terrible scenes we have witnessed here for the past 10 days. We came out of the shelter. Our 3 Heinkel 111s, meanwhile, had already taken to the air. It became clear to me why the pilots were in such a hurry to leave the nursery. Everything here bore the stamp of death and ruin. 2 elderly officers approached me. It turned out that they were the 2 regimental commanders who had flown out of Morozovsk at 4 o'clock in the morning. They were waiting for me in one of the shelters. From the conversation with them, I found out that they were former officers of the Manning Service, who in peacetime worked in the management of the conscription area, or respectively in the staff offices. They asked Army headquarters what assignment they were being given. No one could tell them where to report. I ordered to connect me with Schmidt, who ordered their departure. With his characteristic brevity, he sent me to the adjutant of the VI Army Corps, from whom the request had been received. But the latter replied to a telephony inquiry that in the VI Corps all the places are occupied. He never requested such a replenishment. This was certainly no good. In such a dangerous situation, to force 2 elderly officers to fly out to the boiler without any need. What was I to do? They could only fly back on Schmidt's orders. I was not authorized to give them such an order, but I wanted to get Paulus to order their departure. So I asked the officers to wait at the airfield until the decision was made. A passenger car took me to the command post near the station Gumrak. A month ago, I had travelled this road many times. At that time, cars with cargoes to supply the troops rolled day and night to Stalingrad. Signs gave a clear orientation. Field gendarmerie regulated the traffic. Now this road appeared before me in a completely different form. Along the road were people with haggard faces, wearing bandages soaked with blood. The heads and legs of soldiers were wrapped in rags. The road markers had long been used for campfires, and the field gendarmes had disappeared. But the milestones on the way along the highway from Pitomnik to Stalingrad were broken cars, abandoned helmets, gas masks and rifles. Like ghosts, horse skeletons protruded from the thin shroud of snow. Meat was cut down with axes by hungry soldiers. At the command post reigned an extremely nervous mood. I wanted to first obtain permission for the return flight of regimental commanders and went to Schmidt. He categorically refused. In this situation, we cannot allow to fly any officer, even if he is seriously wounded, he objected in response to my arguments. I made a tactical error, which could hardly be corrected. General Paulus would have granted my request, but I knew from experience that he is reluctant to cancel the orders of Schmidt. Nevertheless, after a brief thought, I decided to ask the commander to allow the 3 regimental commanders to fly back. I went to Paulus and reported to him about my request. Who requested these officers? Colonel of the General Staff Bader in Morozovsk gave me a telegram signed by Schmidt, Mr. General. All corps adjutants assure me that they have made no requests for regimental commanders. In the short time since my arrival, I have been unable to ascertain who is responsible for this absurdity. Then let Schmidt give the order to fly back. That's why I went to him at once, but Schmidt refused. I think it's wrong. Gotha's unblocking army came in today. Let's wait until it establishes contact with us. Then we'll transfer all 3 back to the reserve of the Army Group Command. Let them until then at the disposal of the Bio Army Corps. Thus was decided the fate of these elderly officers. They were uselessly stuck in the VI Corps headquarters and eventually died in the cauldron together with thousands of people. Except for unpleasant impressions in connection with an unfortunate episode in the activities of the military bureaucracy, I was glad to be together with Paulus again. He received me extremely cordially. Already at the first careful glance I could see how he was exhausted by the disastrous situation of the army. The nervous twitching of his face seemed almost unceasing. He hunched over even more. Bitter disappointment could be heard in his speeches. He was dissatisfied with himself and his actions. Having just returned from a trip to the western section of the cauldron, where there had been particularly heavy fighting, tired and exhausted, he only asked me where I had settled. When I told him that I still had not yet received any instructions from the Chief of Staff, he suggested that I look around first and report to him again by 4 p.m. He told me that I had not yet received any instructions from the Chief of Staff. He added that I would have a lot of work to do in the coming days. For the past 3 weeks, no submissions for awards or orders for promotion had been prepared. That's why he called me in. I came up for air again. The few shelters of the army headquarters were located in the open steppe, half above ground, half below ground. Not a single tree, not a single bush that served as cover. The parking lot of all the vehicles was several hundred meters away. Oberleutnant Zimmermann told me that here used to be the command post of the 295th Infantry Division. There were other bunkers all around, connected by roads for transportation and paths. Would I find my way through this maze? First I had to report to Major General Schmidt. His hideout was located next to the commander's bunker. May I ask, Mr. General, where is my department stationed? We didn't have room for you here. Your clerks are about 1 kilometre away. Oberleutnant Schatz will take you there. I walked with Schmidt's orderly through the deep snow for 10 minutes, 15 minutes. Finally we found ourselves in front of the entrance to the dugout. Smoke was coming from the half-open door. Entering, at first I saw nothing at all. There were no windows in the shelter. The little dugout was smoking from all its crevices. Only gradually did I make out the figures of Oberfeldfebel Küpper and Ober-Efreiter Asch. Both of them were glad to see me. I was choking on smoke. Tears were streaming from my eyes. I coughed. I could not breathe any longer and had to go out into the air with the two officers. "There's no way you can live here, Mr. Colonel. The two of us can barely fit in a hole 3 square meters in size. You can't even put a typewriter on the small tables. There's no real work to be done. We have to open the door, otherwise we can't see anything. But then our fingers get stiff from the cold and can't bend at all." "Well, well," I objected. "Don't be too downhearted. We'll get it all right somehow." The smoke cleared a little so that I could get a closer look at the shelter. There were wooden bunks along the long wall, one above the other, with a few blankets on them. Another bed could not be put here. The earthen floor was frozen solid. When I lit a cigarette, ice crystals glistened on the walls in the light of the match. No, there was really no way 3 people could live in this hole. We needed another shelter. General Schmidt agreed, too, when I described everything to him vividly. I was to settle temporarily in the bunker of General Paulus. A small room in the shelter of the operations department was freed for my staff. In the meantime, it was the 4th hour of the day. It was time to go to Paulus. Although for the last 3 or 4 days I had already learned from General von Gablens and Colonel Bader something about the situation in the cauldron, I was worried about a lot of still unclear questions. But first Paulus asked questions. He was primarily interested in the situation outside the boiler. "What is the situation on the lower Cheer and north of Morozovsk? What task was assigned to your battle group, Adam?" I detailed the development of events from November 22nd to December 10th and ended as follows. Army Group required me to hold the bridgehead east of Verkhna-Chirskaya under all circumstances to facilitate the withdrawal of the 6th Army to the west, or respectively to the southeast. The soldiers and officers of the battle group were very disappointed when they learned that the army had taken a circular defence and did not take any steps to break the encirclement ring. And I waited daily for the army to begin to break through to the southwest. The last days, soldiers often asked me why they are here shedding streams of blood if the army does not break through the encirclement. As I was finishing my report, the Chief of Operations entered. Colonel Ellep shook my hand firmly. "It is fortunate that you are finally here. The last 3 weeks I was by necessity engaged in your affairs, but, admittedly, with a sin in half." Paulus interrupted him. "Adam, I haven't answered your questions yet. I'll try to consistently outline the catastrophic course of events after November 22nd. Then you much will be clearer." After a brief pause, Paulus continued. "You know that as early as November 21st, I proposed to withdraw the army behind the Don. Having flown to the boiler, I called a meeting of corps commanders. In full agreement with them, I, on November 22nd and in the following days, repeated my appeal to the General Command of Land Forces with the proposal to break out of the cauldron. On November 24th should have followed the order to break through. But nothing came of it. At a meeting with Hitler, Goering stated that he was able to supply the 6th Army by air. After that, the Führer decided to reject my proposal. Instead of the breakthrough order, I received this radiogram. The commander handed me a piece of paper. I carefully read the following text. 6th Army temporarily blocked by Russian forces. I intend to concentrate the army in the area north of Stalingrad, Kotluban, height 137, height 135, Marinovka, Tsibenko, southern outskirts. The army can be sure that I will do everything necessary to supply it and timely deblock. I know the brave 6th Army and its commander, and I am convinced that it will fulfill its duty. Captain Adolf Hitler." Without saying a word, I returned the paper. "You see, Adam, I could not do otherwise. After receiving the radiogram, I again gathered all corps commanders, including the commanders of the Xi Army and Fortev Tank Corps, which in the meantime had already crossed 1 year on the other side of the Don and part of their formations occupied the western section of the defence. Each more or less strongly expressed doubts about the possibility of supplying the army by air. In the end, however, all agreed with my proposal, under the circumstances, to refrain from breaking through the encirclement. Only one man persistently defended the opposite point of view, General Seidlitz. I understand what Hitler's orders mean, Herr General, but I know that both Colonel Bader and the highest officers of the Air Force expressed the opinion from the beginning that it was impossible to supply an army of 330,000 men by air. Seidlitz demanded that I act contrary to the Führer's order. I had no reason to do so. Seidlitz himself gave us a clear example of what happens when commanders act at their own risk. He took back the 94th Infantry Division in the northeastern section of the Cauldron without our knowledge. The enemy figured out the manoeuvre and immediately hit the retreating units. The division was completely defeated, so we were forced to disband it. I ordered the division headquarters to fly outside the Cauldron. Our actions can only succeed when they are consistent with the intentions of the High Command. The phone rang. Since December 12th was established communication with Army Group Don on short waves, called manstein. Paulus nodded his head, letting us go. Then I did not have the opportunity to learn in detail about the tragic fate of the 94th Infantry Division. Many months later, in captivity, General von Seidlitz told me that, giving the 94th Infantry Division the order to retreat, he was firmly convinced that its actions were in accordance with the planned breakthrough plan proposed by the Army Command itself. Not the fault of Seidlitz that 2 or 3 days later Paulus obeyed Hitler's order. However, and was already under serious threat northeastern defence strip near the Volga, could not be held by the forces of extremely stretched along the front and very weakened 94th Division. Thanks to the manoeuvre, conducted on the order of Seidlitz, this section of defence was reduced by 15 kilometres. Paulus, being an educated officer of the General Staff, soberly assessed the situation. He was well aware that the army is threatened with mortal danger. But the thought of breaking the received order contradicted his military education. From the beginning, a characteristic feature of Paulus, like many officers of the older generation, was a deep conflict between responsibility to the soldiers and military discipline. After a hard internal struggle, military discipline triumphed. I escorted Colonel Elklep to his hideout. There we continued our conversation. "You know, Adam, our quartermaster was quite right. Lieutenant Colonel von Kunowski, who is now replacing Bader in the boiler, has had a lot of grief right off the bat. There was not a single day when the planes delivered the tonnage of supplies minimally needed to supply the army. Famine is looming. Unless an outside debuffing strike is successful, I think the outlook is bleak. Trapped in a goddamn hole like this, wouldn't it be better to disobey Hitler's orders and break through? No, we don't know the intentions and capabilities of the High Command. Schmidt and I supported Paulus's decision, and you would do the same if you were here." What could I say to that? It was too difficult for me to imagine myself in the position in which the army commander was placed. I knew firmly only one thing, that General Paulus decides everything only on mature reflection. Elklep continued. The meeting with the corps commanders towards the end took an acutely dramatic character. All sharply opposed Seidlitz. Colonel General Geitz threatened that he would shoot him if he continued to call for disobedience to Hitler. Seidlitz then submitted a report note to Schulus, which we sent in the original further to the command of Army Group B. If you visit in the coming days LI Army Corps, which is located not far from here, you will familiarize yourself with this memorandum. In breaking out of the Cauldron at Demyansk last year, Seidlitz gained a wealth of experience which he carries over to our conditions. What he writes there is not without interest. The head of the operations department was summoned to Schmidt. With all the anxiety that seized me after these stories, I was impatient to get down to urgent work. So I hurried to my room. Cooper had already prepared something for me. I needed as soon as possible to get an idea of the number of personnel in the divisions and in the troops subordinate directly to the army. It was not so easy. Many formations were scattered. In one place, the remnants of some battalion had been withdrawn to cover gaps in the western or southern section. In another, a composite unit had been created and thrown into battle. Often, the officer did not know the soldiers of his unit. Often, a soldier did not know the name of his officer, or even his neighbour. On the killed and wounded reported only numerical decay. By evening, we brought some order to this confusion. About 19 hours, I was called to dinner at the shelter Paulusa. At the commander gathered Chief of Staff, Chief of Operations, Quartermaster, Chief of Intelligence, Senior Communications Officer, personal adjutants. First, I had to tell about what was happening outside the cauldron. Then the conversation turned to the events in the boiler. In this regard, I learned that the command of Army Group Don, only the first days after the creation of the group, sent to the boiler higher officers to get an idea of the actual situation in the cauldron. At the end of November, for a few hours, flew to the boiler for a few hours, the Chief of Staff of the Army Group, Major General Schultz, followed shortly after by the Chief of Operations, Colonel Busset. After this, contact was mainly maintained by radio. Paulus did not have the opportunity to personally talk with General Feldmarschall von Manstein. This was undoubtedly a great defect. Nevertheless, this evening in our circle reigned very high spirits. After all, Gotha's army began to strike to break through the cauldron from the outside, and by evening had advanced significantly. If the army will maintain this rate of advance, at the latest in a week with it will be established communication, said one of the young adjutants. Paulus somewhat cooled this optimism. If the 4th Panzer Army will maintain this pace, well, that you made such a reservation, it should be clear to you, Zimmermann, that so far Goth threw back only the forward guard of the Red Army troops. The fight with the main forces is yet to come. Let's hope that Goth's army has sufficient penetrating power. I remembered the conversation I had the day before in Morozovsk with Colonel Wenck, the German Chief of Staff of the 3rd Romanian Army. If I am not mistaken, I intervened in the conversation, LVII Tank Corps, including the 6th and 23rd Panzer Divisions, as well as the 15th Airfield, is a shock wedge of the Army of Gotha. Romanian infantry and cavalry divisions follow to cover the flanks, except for the 6th Armoured Division, which is fully manned and has now arrived from France. All other divisions are no longer at full strength. This applies above all to the Romanian divisions, which were on November 20th at the beginning of the counter-offensive of the Red Army scattered and turned into flight. That is correct, confirmed Schmidt. In the coming days, Goth should also receive the 17th Panzer Division. Paulus thought. When the adjutants left and remained only department heads, he said, I cease to understand the High Command. Apparently, it has not learned any lessons from the heavy defeats of recent weeks. The composition of Gotha's army is a stunning example of how the strength of the Red Army is still irresponsibly underestimated. Adam told me that the few divisions arriving were barely enough to cover the daily gaps in the Shira section. In my opinion, I added, our troops will not be able to hold on to the lower Chia. Hitherto the Russians have probed us with their vanguards. We could repel them only with the utmost exertion of strength. In case of an enemy offensive with large forces, the front on the Chira will quickly collapse. But it would threaten Gotha's army from the flank. She will no longer have ways to retreat. Paulus nodded. Let's believe, gentlemen, that the main command in time to bring reserves. Turning to me, Paulus said, Army Command has already submitted to Army Group Don its proposals for a breakthrough from the boiler. Elklep will familiarize you with them. With these words, Paulus rose from his seat. We said goodbye to him. I escorted the Chief of Operations to his shelter, located just a few steps away. It was a frosty winter night. Elklep remarked sceptically, Frankly, I don't hold out much hope for Goth's operation. You were here from the beginning, Elklep, in direct contact with the troops. It is still incomprehensible to me why the army did not immediately break through to the southwest. It was certainly still possible for the first 2 or 3 days. That's exactly what we wanted. You didn't live through those terrible days here with us. Day after day, we asked by radio for permission to break through. Army Group B supported our appeal. Hitler and the General Command of Land Forces rejected it. In the end, Army Group B supported the order of the High Command. It was a real contest of strength between the army and the higher authorities. Being weaker, we lost. The General Command of Land Forces claims to be able to better assess the situation in the cauldron than the Sixth Army, which is stuck in it. Hitler determined exactly where the western and southern defence lines of the cauldron should run. In the defence line outlined in Hitler's order, no trench, no village, no line can be left without his permission. We are now only well-paid non-commissioned officers. In his workroom, the colonel handed me a folder of papers. Read it. These were the army proposals mentioned by Paulus. Their content was summarised as follows. Apparently, the 4th Tank Army does not have enough forces to completely break the ring around Stalingrad. If it did not achieve its objective, the chances of a breakthrough would deteriorate considerably. If only for supply reasons, the 6th Army will not be able to resist for long. At this point, it is impossible to foresee how and when our broken front on the Don will stabilise. Even if the offensive of the 4th Panzer Army is successful, Gotha's army is in danger of being cut off. 3. Based on this assessment of the situation, the command of the 6th Army asks to authorise a breakthrough from the cauldron to the southwest, coordinated in time with the offensive of the 4th Tank Army, with which it will join southwest of Stalingrad. In terms of its fighting capacity, the 6th Army can cope with this task, taking with it the wounded. High Command will receive at its disposal reserves for the deployment of a new front. That was, in my opinion, correct, realistic assessment of the situation. I told this to El Kalepu, but expressed doubt whether now it is still possible to realise the third point. This question, of course, is difficult to solve, replied the head of the operational department. Presenting our proposals, we wanted first of all to ensure that they're again carefully thought through all the planned activities. I simply cannot believe that the High Command is frivolously put at mortal risk an army of 22 divisions. I am concerned, however, that Gotha's army has not been reinforced with at least 1 battalion, and we still have to wait here. As a soldier, I will always respect the orders of the higher commanding authorities. But beyond that, I would also like to understand them. Frankly speaking, lately I've not been very good at it. I had the greatest confidence in Manstein. But isn't it ridiculous when the Field Marshal, in such a desperate situation, makes stereotyped references to the Führer? The Führer ordered this and that. Shouldn't he have acted in a much more coordinated manner with our army headquarters? Read more of this. Only when senior commanders dropped out, their names were given. Under such circumstances, it took a lot of labour to get a somewhat real picture. Toward evening, we brought some order to this confusion. About 7 p.m., I was called to dinner at Paulus's hideout. At the commander gathered Chief of Staff, Chief of Operations, Quartermaster, Chief of Intelligence, Senior Liaison Officer, Personal Adjutants. First, I had to tell about what was happening outside the cauldron. Then the conversation turned to the events in the boiler. In this regard, I learned that the command of Army Group Don, only the first days after the creation of the group, sent to the boiler higher officers to get an idea of the actual situation in the cauldron. At the end of November for a few hours, flew to the boiler for a few hours, the Chief of Staff of the Army Group, Major General Schultz, followed shortly after by the Chief of Operations, Colonel Büsser. After this, contact was mainly maintained by radio. Paulus did not have the opportunity to personally talk with Generalfeldmarschall von Manstein. This was undoubtedly a great defect. Nevertheless, this evening in our circle reigned very high spirits. After all, Gotha's army began to strike to break through the cauldron from the outside, and by evening had advanced significantly. If the army will maintain this rate of advance, at the latest in a week, with it will be established communication. said one of the young adjutants. Paulus somewhat cooled this optimism. If the 4th Panzer Army will maintain this pace— Well, that you made such a reservation. It should be clear to you, Zimmermann, that so far Goth threw back only the forward guard of the Red Army troops. The fight with the main forces is yet to come. Let's hope that Goth's army has sufficient penetrating power. I remembered the conversation I had the day before in Morozovsk with Colonel Wenck, the German Chief of Staff of the 3rd Romanian Army. If I am not mistaken, I intervened in the conversation, LVII Tank Corps, including the 6th and 23rd Panzer Divisions, as well as the 15th Airfield, is a shock wedge of the Army of Gotha. Romanian infantry and cavalry divisions follow to cover the flanks. Except for the 6th Armoured Division, which is fully manned and has now arrived from France, all other divisions are no longer at full strength. This applies above all to the Romanian divisions, which were on November 20th at the beginning of the counter-offensive of the Red Army scattered and turned into flight. That is correct, confirmed Schmidt. In the coming days, Goth should also receive the 17th Panzer Division. Paulus thought. When the adjutants left and remained only department heads, he said, I cease to understand the High Command. Apparently, it has not learned any lessons from the heavy defeats of recent weeks. The composition of Gotha's army is a stunning example of how the strength of the Red Army is still irresponsibly underestimated. Adam told me that the few divisions arriving were barely enough to cover the daily gaps in the Chira section. In my opinion, I added, our troops will not be able to hold on to the lower Chir. Hitherto the Russians have probed us with their vanguards. We could repel them only with the utmost exertion of strength. In case of an enemy offensive with large forces, the front on the Chira will quickly collapse, but it would threaten Gotha's army from the flank. She will no longer have ways to retreat. Paulus nodded. Let's believe, gentlemen, that the main command in time to bring reserves. Turning to me, Paulus said, Army Command has already submitted to Army Group Don its proposals for a breakthrough from the boiler. Elklep will familiarize you with them. With these words, Paulus rose from his seat. We said goodbye to him. I escorted the Chief of Operations to his shelter, located just a few steps away. It was a frosty winter night. Elklep remarked sceptically. Frankly, I don't hold out much hope for Goth's operation. You were here from the beginning, Elklep, in direct contact with the troops. It is still incomprehensible to me why the army did not immediately break through to the southwest. It was certainly still possible for the first 2 or 3 days. That's exactly what we wanted. You didn't live through those terrible days here with us. Day after day we asked by radio for permission to break through. Army Group B supported our appeal. Hitler and the General Command of Land Forces rejected it. In the end, Army Group B supported the order of the High Command. It was a real contest of strength between the army and the higher authorities. Being weaker, we lost. The General Command of Land Forces claims to be able to better assess the situation in the cauldron than the 6th Army, which is stuck in it. Hitler determined exactly where the western and southern defence lines of the cauldron should run. In the defence line outlined in Hitler's order, no trench, no village, no line can be left without his permission. We are now only well-paid non-commissioned officers. In his workroom, the colonel handed me a folder of papers. Read it. These were the army proposals mentioned by Paulus. Their content was summarized as follows. Apparently, the 4th Tank Army does not have enough forces to completely break the ring around Stalingrad. If it did not achieve its objective, the chances of a breakthrough would deteriorate considerably. If only for supply reasons, the 6th Army will not be able to resist for long. At this point, it is impossible to foresee how and when our broken front on the Don will stabilize. Even if the offensive of the 4th Panzer Army is successful, Gotha's army is in danger of being cut off. Based on this assessment of the situation, the command of the 6th Army asks to authorize a breakthrough from the cauldron to the southwest, coordinated in time with the offensive of the 4th Tank Army, with which it will join southwest of Stalingrad. In terms of its fighting capacity, the Sixth Army can cope with this task, taking with it the wounded. High Command will receive at its disposal reserves for the deployment of a new front. That was, in my opinion, correct, realistic assessment of the situation. I told this to El Klepu, but expressed doubt, whether now it is still possible to realise the third point. This question, of course, is difficult to solve, replied the head of the operations department. Presenting our proposals, we wanted first of all to ensure that there again carefully thought through all the planned activities. I simply cannot believe that the High Command is frivolously put at mortal risk an army of 22 divisions. I am concerned, however, that Gotha's army has not been reinforced with at least 1 battalion, and we still have to wait here. As a soldier, I will always respect the orders of the higher commanding authorities. But beyond that, I would also like to understand them. Frankly speaking, lately I've not been very good at it. I had the greatest confidence in Manstein. But isn't it ridiculous when the field marshal, in such a desperate situation, makes stereotyped references to the Führer? The Führer ordered this and that. Shouldn't he have acted in a much more coordinated manner with our army headquarters? Read more of this. Stalingrad Fortress. The colonel showed me some radiograms from Hitler's headquarters. I could tell from the stamps that they had arrived immediately after the outbreak of the cauldron. It was hard to believe what it said. From now on, the Sixth Army is called Stalingrad Fortress. Elklip noticed the puzzled look on my face. What? Are you surprised? Now at least you know where you are. In Stalingrad Fortress. If I hadn't read it myself, I would have suspected you were trying to play a trick on me. Fortress of Stalingrad. What do Paulus, Schmidt, and other generals say about this nonsense? The same thing you say. It doesn't make sense. The concept of fortress is inapplicable even to the territory of a city. Even there's no unified communications network. There are no bomb shelters, no long-term armoured fortifications, no underground passages, no barriers. The ruins of houses and cellars can only serve as shelter from shell splinters or from the weather. It is out of the question to build up any long-term reserves. However, you know all this from your own experience. And what is the situation on the new sections of the front, west and south? Elklep? Here the name fortress sounds like a mockery. There are no trenches, no shelters, just holes dug at night in the ground, which is completely frozen and covered with snow. Snow pits. They serve our soldiers as a fighting position and resting place, a little protection from the penetrating steppe wind. That's all. A stronger Russian attack, and our starving, half-frozen and overworked soldiers will not hold their positions. All this, concluded the Chief of Operations, something that I find it difficult to approve. But after all, we are soldiers, and know what an order is. It was already late. I shook Elhlep's hand goodbye. On the way, the icy Nordost whipped in my face, penetrated my clothes. In the distance, I could hear shells bursting. On the highway, Pitomnik, Stalingrad cars rumbled. In the air rumbled a few Junkers 52 or Heinkel 111, which, unfortunately, delivered to us only a tiny fraction of what was necessary to live and fight. On this, my first night in the cauldron, the night of December 13th, I tossed restlessly on a straw mattress for a long time and rose when it was still dark. The ordinaries were already preparing a meagre breakfast. This time there was a scrap more bread than usual, for I had brought several loaves from Morozovsk. I sat at the table together with General Paulus. In front of each of us was a cup of hot black coffee. Slowly we chewed 3 pieces of soldier's bread, which were due to us. Paulus's gaze was fixed on the operational map hanging on the wall. The front line in the place of a deep breakthrough west of the Don was marked in accordance with my reported data. From Kotelnikov, 3 bold blue arrows were drawn in a northerly direction. "Received new news regarding Gotha's army, Mr. General?" I asked. As Schmidt informed me by telephone, the operation is proceeding according to plan. Since yesterday we have shortwave communication with Army Group Don, so we can get more up-to-date information than before. but I'm not too optimistic yet. From your report yesterday, it is clear that the situation outside the cauldron is more serious than I thought. Look at the map. The 8th Italian Army is threatened from both flank and rear, and in order to provide defence on a wide front at the point of breakthrough, in fact, there are only battle groups. If the enemy goes on the offensive again, there will be a disaster even greater than now. I just cannot imagine, Mr. General, how they are going to stabilise the situation at the front. Do we even have the strength to form new armies? Won't all the measures of the General Command of Land Forces be too late? Will the Italians hold their section of the front on the Don? If the 8th Italian Army is thrown back, the Hungarians will be forced to abandon their positions. Then there will be a threat from the rear of even the 2nd German Army on the Voronezh front. In itself, the situation in the area along the Chir River could be stabilised if the General Command of the Land Forces has operational and strategic reserves and has already moved them towards the threatened areas. I cannot tell you anything definite about that. However, after the sad experience of the last 3 weeks, I am sceptical about the competence of the High Command and its decisions. One more question, if I may, Mr. General. Elklep showed me Hitler's radiogram, according to which Goth must restore the former front line. That would mean we have to stay here. With the precarious situation outside the cauldron, such an order, in my opinion, would be madness. That is indeed the order. And yet we have prepared ourselves to be able to fight our way towards Goth. I hope that the General Command of the Land Forces will realise, at least at the last minute, that the only way to save the army is my proposal to abandon the city and make our way to the southwest. My efforts to get a correct idea of the strength of our divisions and formations led to little. I therefore decided to visit some course adjutants to discuss with them how we could at least roughly ascertain the fighting ability and strength of the various troop units. I started with the LI Army Corps stationed near the LI headquarters. The corps was mostly located within the city. Except for the defeat of the 94th Infantry Division described above, this corps had suffered the fewest casualties since the beginning of the counter-offensive. The city became the calmest fighting section of the cauldron. "How is the mood in the headquarters?" I asked the adjutant. "Bad," he replied. "The old man swears like a cobbler. He is furious that Paulus in action, although he sees that the 6th Army slowly but surely dying. Seidlitz considers irresponsible chatter Goering's promise of 22 divisions to supply by air. He's realised that since Demyansk. Perhaps you'd like to read his memo, or are you already familiar with it? I heard about the memo at our headquarters. Do you have the text? Certainly, Mr. Colonel. The adjutant went to his document chest, took out a binder and handed it to me. I read with increasing interest, precisely, soberly, irrefutably assessed Seidlitz's catastrophic situation with the supply of our army, the further broad offensive of the Soviet troops, the measures of the General Command of the Land Forces on deblockade, which could only later have an effect, and the combat effectiveness of the troops. All these stark facts forced a decision. Either the 6th Army, taking a circular defence, defends until it does not use up all the ammunition, that is, will remain unarmed. Or, acting offensively, the army breaks the ring of encirclement. These were the final conclusions of the general. He was not frightened by the idea that if necessary to act contrary to Hitler's order to circular defence, and he ended his memorandum with the following words: "If the General Command of the Ground Forces does not immediately cancel the order to circular defence, the voice of his own conscience tells us to do our duty to the army and the German people, ourselves to return the freedom of action, which we were deprived of the order, and use the still available opportunity to our offensive to prevent disaster. Threatens the total destruction of 200,000 soldiers and all material. There is no other choice." Here is a manifestation of civil courage, boldness, and readiness for independent action. That's how I perceived the note at that time. It did not occur to me that Seidlitz could have any other purpose than to save the army for the continuation of the struggle. For a moment I even had a thought. What if Seidlitz, and not Paulus, was the commander of the 6th Army? I highly appreciated Paulus, but this time I paid tribute to Seidlitz. I asked the adjutant what was the fate of the memo. It was in the original sent by the army further through the army group to the General Command of Land Forces, and, here you will laugh, on Seidlitz was entrusted with the command of the entire northern and eastern sections of the cauldron. How did Paulus react to such a narrowing of his authority as commander? I can't tell you that, Mr. Colonel. I only know that there was an explanation between Paulus and Seidlitz. After receiving information about the personnel of the LI Army Corps, I drove back to my headquarters. I could not understand how it happened that Hitler entrusted Fronder Seidlitz with command of the most important parts of the defence in the cauldron. Didn't he thus want to tame a general from an old military family? But why was this done without Paulus? Probably Elep can answer these questions. Now, after my return, I went to see him. He met me with words. Well, have you read the memo by Seidlitz? What do you say about it? I admire the precision and consistency of judgment. Of course, I was astonished when I read the suggestion to act against the Führer's orders. We all disagree with this conclusion. Paulus, Schmidt, myself, and other corps commanders. This is, in my opinion, anarchy. I recognize that it is the duty and right of the army commander to make independent decisions, but only when he has no communication with higher command authorities. But this is not the case with us. The High Command has been informed of our situation in the most detailed manner. It is absurd to assume that the General Command of the Land Forces intends to sacrifice us. Paulus told me yesterday that Hitler wanted to order the army to break through. Then, under the influence of Goering, he made a different decision. Neither Paulus, nor Schmidt, nor you, nor any of the corps commanders, and none of us, do not believe, given the general situation at the fronts, that the army, and now still numbering 270,000 people, aviation could supply for a month of food, ammunition, fuel, medical and sanitary means. This is utopia. After all, it was impossible at the beginning of the encirclement. When the red ring around the Sixth Army was not yet dense, the Soviet air defence was still ineffective. And now, when anti-aircraft guns and enemy fighters are so active, it is absolutely impossible. That's right, Adam. Paulus clearly understood this in the first days of the encirclement, and Major General Pickett, commander of the 9th Anti-Aircraft Artillery Division, considered it an illusion to calculate that aviation will provide sufficient supply to our army. Therefore, by order of the army commander, he flew on November 27 to the Army Group headquarters to fully inform Field Marshal von Manstein about the dangerous situation in the cauldron and to discuss with the competent authorities of the Air Force the prospects for maximum and, most importantly, uninterrupted supply of our army. Pickett was instructed to frankly outline our doubts about the reality of supply by air and emphasize that the army can only save the breakthrough with outside support. In this case, there is no more time to lose. By the way, one more question, Elklep. If we have to keep the army's fighting ability, how many vehicles should be flown into the cauldron every day? You know, Adam, that we need at least 700 tons of cargo a day. One Junkers 52 takes 2 tons. That would mean, therefore, that 350 Junkers would have to land at the cauldron every day. But the payload capacity of the Heinkel 111 is only 1.5 tons. So if there are not available a sufficient number of Junkers 52, then we already need more than 400 machines. The same answer was given to me by Colonel Barder. And how many cars actually arrived in recent days? I asked. Only a small part of the required number, at best 1/4. But let me continue my story. A few days ago, Pickett returned. He reported to Paulus about his long conversation with General Fiebig, commander of the 8th Air Corps, which Hitler entrusted to supply the 6th Army by air. Although the corps is exempted from all other combat assignments by order of Hitler, Fiebig is forced to state that he does not have enough vehicles to airlift the required tonnage to the boiler. The general himself found himself in an untenable position. On December 11th, he flew to the boiler and promised Paulus and Schmidt that he would do everything in human power to help the severely distressed Sixth Army. But it's not just the lack of airplanes. Sometimes severe frost, blizzard, and thick fog almost paralyze air traffic. As a result, so far there has not been a single day when it would have been possible to deliver even a quarter of the required tonnage. Probably in the coming days we will be forced to further reduce the bread ration, which at the end of November was set at the rate of 200 grams per day. I learned back in Morozovsk that many divisions lost all their food stores and even field kitchens during the escape, and have been starving for a number of days. It is so. Therefore, Paulus, immediately after his arrival in the boiler, ordered all parts to accurately take into account the stocks of food, uniforms, ammunition, and fuel, and report how much is available. Quartermasters and intendants are ordered to take care of an even distribution. I don't know whether all reported honestly and truthfully what the supplies were. We have had no opportunity of verifying the reports. Consequently, we must recognize that most of the soldiers in the cauldron of the army have been starving for many days. The smaller the number of arriving airplanes, the faster the food shortage grows every day. Where is the solution, Elklep? The way out lies in the uninterrupted, as much as possible supply by air and in the success of the offensive of the army of Gotha. We both don't believe in the reality of an air bridge. It also seems to me very doubtful that the Gotha army that is blocking us will be able to move a land bridge to us. Your optimism does you credit, my dear fellow. But could it be that we are succumbing to a ruinous self-deception? Of course, both my assumptions are still very much in doubt, but we are not sitting idly by. Although Hitler ordered to hold Stalingrad, we have made all the preparations to be able to break through in the next few days to meet the army of Gotha. We must not lose faith in success. General Staff Colonel Elklep belonged to those tens of thousands of officers and soldiers who sincerely believed in the authority of their superiors. Their obedience was based on trust in the High Command. They were willing to risk their lives for it, while firmly convinced that it, on its part, justifies the trust that its actions and decisions are imbued with a sense of high responsibility. Trust in return for responsibility, responsibility in return for trust. This was the formula of the soldiers' thinking and behaviour. Most of us were brought up in this spirit. This is how we lived and fought. But what if the High Command abused our trust? If for some reason, perhaps even frivolity, it neglected its responsibility? I was tormented by doubts. That natural faith, that unshakable trust in the Wehrmacht command had been thoroughly undermined in me. The formula, trust in return for responsibility, responsibility in return for trust, seemed to me questionable, simplistic, even naive in the light of the bitter experience of recent weeks. Wasn't General von Seidlitz right after all? But for the time being, other matters had to be dealt with. One more question, Elklep. Can we take care of the wounded and sick, especially the seriously wounded? Unfortunately, no. As you know, all the major hospitals are located west of the Don. There are only a few small field hospitals stationed near the city and in the steppe. They have been overcrowded for a long time, although we fully load every car on the return trip with seriously wounded. But it is not only the lack of space. First of all, there is not enough dressing material, drugs, medicines, surgical instruments. Replenishment is negligible. Doctors and medical personnel are overloaded, more and more often, and they fall off their feet. The chief of sanitation or the quartermaster can tell you the true tragedies. After the conversation with the chief of operations, I became more aware, but by no means calmer. I went to my place, the shelter of the army commander. Current mail was not much. While I gave orders to Oberfeldfebel Küper, the door opened and Paulus entered. Much to do, Adam? Yes, Herr General. Several submissions for the Knight's Cross and the German Cross in Gold have been approved. I'll send them to the Corps now. The Knight's Cross for losing a battle. Don't you think that's ridiculous? Paulus grinned and continued. You were this morning at the LI Corps headquarters. Is there any news? No, Herr General, or in fact there is still some. I learned something new. The Corps' adjutant told me that all divisions in the northern and eastern sections of the cauldron are subordinate to General Seidlitz. I did not know this yet. Paulus nodded his head slightly and replied in a somewhat resentful tone, "Yes, this is the order of Hitler transmitted by radio. You can read it from me later. I myself do not know what it is actually supposed to mean. Perhaps Hitler wants to see if Seidlitz really has the courage to disobey the order. But it's also possible that Hitler holds Seidlitz in particularly high esteem." "That's not clear to me, General. At first Hitler emphasizes that he is quite reliant on the army commander. A day later he places most of the divisions under General Seidlitz. This is all the more contradictory because it was Seidlitz who demanded that we regain our freedom of action, taken away by order of the Führer. What, in fact, is Seidlitz's point of view on this question now? I asked him about it in the presence of General Strecker. He replied, "Under the circumstances, I must obey." "Come on, I'll show you Hitler's radiogram." In his workroom, Paulus took out of a folder a sheet of paper and gave it to me. I read the following lines, under which was signed Adolf Hitler. "Breakthrough from the boiler excluded. Supply by air is ensured. Under the command of General Gotha concentrates a new army to break through the cauldron from the outside. All divisions operating on the Volga and northern sections of the front are transferred under the command of General von Seidlitz." It was additionally stated that General Paulus retained the rights and authority associated with the overall leadership of the troops in the cauldron. Later, left alone, I pondered for a long time, comparing Paulus and Seidlitz, two opposite characters. Paulus, conscientious, all carefully thought out general stuff, thinker, but indecisive man. Seidlitz, much less educated and less knowledgeable general than Paulus, but a man determined and brave to the point of recklessness. Seidlitz unequivocally defended his point of view, and even in a dispute with Paulus was in conflict with other generals. Nevertheless, he was forced to be silent when he received orders from Hitler, learned that he was distinguished, giving a higher command post, and General von Seidlitz obeyed despite his dissenting opinion. As first adjutant of the army, I often had the opportunity to observe how a promotion, a rise in rank, or the receipt of a high decoration influenced the views, at least the behaviour, of many officers. Seidlitz, too, had relented. Whether this was for the same or similar motives remains unclear to me. The days after December 12th were particularly exciting. Army headquarters was preparing a breakthrough. Gotha's Operation Winter Storm had failed. At the signal Thunderstroke 6th. Army was to break the ring from the inside and move towards Goth. It was meant that all the wounded would be trucked in, if only the supply had been even a little more successful. Up to December 12th, no more than 100 tons of food, ammunition and fuel were airlifted daily. After relentless requests for help from the army, the volume of supplies increased somewhat. But even then it never approached the figure of 300 tons per day, and that was the minimum requirement for food supplies alone. Hunger increasingly tormented the body and soul of the people who were surrounded. In some parts, the number of soldiers, exhausted from hunger, already exceeded the number of wounded. In every shelter, every trench, in every divisional medical station lay exhausted soldiers and officers who could no longer stand on their feet. In this plight, the army took the horses of the Romanian cavalry division, which were already half dead anyway due to lack of fodder. The army's chief of supplies, Captain Tepke, authorized the slaughter of 4,000 horses. As long as the meat and bones of the horses were available, it was possible, at least temporarily, to improve the food supply somewhat. This yielded little, if only because from December 15th the bread ration was reduced to 100 grams. 2 slices of bread a day, liquid horsemeat soup, a few cups of hot vegetable tea or malt coffee, and with such a diet the soldiers had to live, fight, resist frost, snow and blizzards. It is understandable with what excitement and hope 250,000 people trapped in the cauldron treated the advance of the army of Gotha. After the performance of the 4th Panzer Army, people experienced a sense of relief. For a while they returned to confidence, reawakened the will to fight. Again, it made sense to hold firm. Just a few more days, and it will be possible to break the deadly ring. For 2 or 3 days there was a real upswing. When then day after day passed in fruitless waiting, people were grievously disappointed and deep despondency. General Paulus every day from morning left in divisions which were on the most dangerous sites. The morning of December 16, at dawn the thermometer showed more than 30 Tiensdag frost. Paulus spent on the western section, where there were persistent fighting. When he came back by noon, I realized from the expression on his face that he had a heavy heart. "Were you at the 44th Infantry Division today, Mr. General?" "Judging by yesterday evening's report, it suffered heavy losses." "Did the Russians attack again?" I asked. "You know, it's always turbulent in this area. However, the worst thing is that it is not the battle losses that are the main cause of casualties. The division commander and the division doctor reported that in recent days cases of frostbite are increasing. Because of the lack of winter uniforms, soldiers in their snow dens are defenceless against the icy steppe winds. During the day they cannot leave the trenches and ditches even for necessities. Whoever does make such an attempt is most often paid with his life. And since no one can move in these holes, frostbite is inevitable. How can the wounded and sick be evacuated from the front line at all? This is an almost insoluble problem. The enemy opens fire as soon as he notices our movement. Only after dark it is possible to pick up the wounded and help the frostbitten, and this too often results in medical aid being late. Yesterday, I met a communications officer from the 44th Division here at headquarters. He told me that at night the fighting on both sides almost ceases. We have only weak guards left in our positions. Can the resting units at least at this time be accommodated somewhere, Mr. General? The few villages on the steppe have been subjected to heavy shelling, in the summer by us and now by the enemy. There are several shelters between the ruins, for the most part furnished in the fall by our rear units. They are occupied in part by headquarters. They are, of course, far from sufficient. At night everyone climbs in and crowds around the hearths and stoves. Firewood is hardly obtained in Stalingrad. What will happen if the number of divisions will be reduced at the same rate? Who will hold the front line then? Everything depends on how soon we will again restore communication with our troops on the other side of the encirclement ring. But reflect, and you, Adam, about what proposals you can make me. Paulus went to Schmidt. I went to my place and began to study the lists of substituted positions in the divisions and troops of the reserve command. Tank and artillery units that had lost their equipment had already been disbanded, and still capable officers and soldiers used in the infantry. However, it would have been possible to identify those fit for combat among the soldiers of the rear service and higher troop headquarters, whose work was gradually minimized. It would also be possible to recruit among our divisions here in the city officers and soldiers to reinforce the infantry in the threatened areas of the front. I decided at the first opportunity to talk to Schmidt. While I was thinking about all this, the orderly came and said that I was asked for a meeting in the room of the Chief of Staff. General Paulus and Elklep were already there. Following me came the head of the intelligence department and the acting Oberquartiermeister. Major General Schmidt stood in front of the map of the situation. At the sign of the commander, he began his report. "I just spoke with the Chief of Staff of Army Group Don General Schultz on shortwave radio. He informed me that this morning the Red Army began action against the right flank of Army Group Don and the left flank of Army Group B. Probably the enemy intends to break through towards Rostov. Now the situation is still unclear. LVI Tank Corps, Gotha. Fierce battles with large enemy forces and very slowly moving forward. His vanguards are fighting in the area Verkhnekumsky, Vodyansky, Krugliakov. That is about 50 kilometers from our southern section. Army Group Don again proposed to the General Command of Land Forces to allow the 6th Army to break through from the encirclement. Consequently, we must assume that in this extreme critical situation, the General Command will finally enter our situation. I ask the Chief of Operations and Quartermaster to report on how the preparations are going. At first, the voice of the Chief of Staff slightly trembled with excitement, but by the end of the speech, Schmidt calmed down. Chief of Operations in his speech added to the above. Our 40-50 still combat-ready tanks are concentrated near the intended place of breakthrough. Fuel reserves are enough for at least 30 kilometres. The Tank Corps commander is tasked to break through the enemy defence line and establish communication with the LVII Tank Corps. The site of the breakthrough must be secured from the flanks so that the 6th Army could get out of the cauldron. Withdrawal of our divisions prepared in all areas. Acting Oberkartermeister Lieutenant Colonel von Kunowski reported. Captain Tepke is, as stipulated by the order, in Karpovka. He concentrated their vehicles with a payload of 700 tons and will move after our attacking tanks. His task is to receive the cargoes delivered by Gotha's army and bring them as quickly as possible to our advancing divisions. Seat. Air Corps was ordered to drop in the resulting gap fuel and ammunition for our tanks fighting their way south. Divisional artillery and field kitchens will be attached to trucks. The necessary number of vehicles are on standby. Schmidt added that all surplus combat vehicles should be prepared for destruction. During these reports or messages, Paulus was looking at the map. Now he turned to face us. Hopefully, the order will come very soon. Otherwise, there is a danger that we will no longer be able to fulfill it. Day by day, the strength of our soldiers is dwindling. Ammunition, food, fuel and medicines are dwindling. Today there is only enough fuel for 30 kilometres of attack, and in 4 or 5 days the stock of fuel may be so reduced that we will no longer be able to any attack. After this serious, though not unexpected assessment of the situation, we parted. Of course, the preparations in the Karpovka neighbourhood could not escape our troops. The common soldier was unusually sensitive on this point. If the slow advance of Gotha's army gave rise to a certain despondency, the news of the forthcoming breakthrough from the cauldron, which spread with the speed of the wind, caused a new rise of optimism. The soldiers were ready to forget all the sufferings and sacrifices they had made in recent weeks, just to get out of this mousetrap. To get out of the cauldron, it meant to get regular and nourishing food, release from frontline service, peace and long-awaited vacation, a visit with his wife and children, parents, brothers and sisters. The deceptive hope promised the extremely tired, exhausted soldiers. Our clerks and orderlies were also glowing in anticipation of future happiness. They were no longer sitting so apathetically and aimlessly at their desks. When, on December 16th, I came in the evening to my clerks in their hiding place, Oberfeldwebel Küpper, laughing merrily, met me with the words, "Well, Mr. Colonel, we're in the clear. How glad we are to get out of this cursed hole again. Our people back home have no idea what's happened here. Only yesterday I received a letter from my wife, and she asked me for the 10th time, no less, why I don't come on vacation. Lucky man, and I, dear Küpper, since November 19th, I have not received any letters from my relatives. But now we can hope again. Gather up all the writing to destroy it. We don't need to burden ourselves with it when we break through." "Will do, Mr. Colonel. We've just had a clerk from the LI Army Corps. As he says, General von Seidlitz set an example for us. He burned literally everything, uniforms, underwear, boots, camera, books, left only what he was wearing. I couldn't help laughing. That's exactly what Seidlitz was. Ardent and did everything thoroughly, not a fan of half measures. These days our headquarters came to life. The apparatus was in full swing. Communications officers, telephone conversations, radiograms, orders, reports. Schmidt was especially in uniform. Paulus spoke almost daily on the radio with Field Marshal von Manstein. Most of these conversations I have heard and stenographed. They are not much different from each other. Paulus sought an answer to his questions. What is the situation at the place of the Soviet breakthrough west of the Don? When can we count on the arrival of deblocking troops? Is restored on the Khyra continuous stable front? Has the enemy offensive been suspended? Will General Hollit soon move to a counter-offensive? Manstein answered sparingly, unspecific. Paulus angry that the commander of Army Group, Don, apparently ill-informed. How can I make any decisions here if I do not know what is done around? I do not know what Manstein and the main command undertake and plan. I always hear only one thing. Hold on. That's what we've been doing for a month now, and we're getting killed. It looks like Goth is unlikely to advance. His LVII Panzer Corps is on the defensive. Maybe, Mr. General, we could help Goth if we went on the offensive and broke through to meet him. Then the Russians would have to fight on two fronts and disperse their forces. That's true, Adam, but so far Manstein hasn't authorized it. He's supposed to authorize the launch of the operation codenamed Thunderstrike, and he still hasn't said a word. Hitler and the High Command still want us to hold the city, and Manstein is afraid to give an order in his own name, even though he knows of our dire situation. Then, immediately after the encirclement, the order to hold out to the end, by the way, was motivated by the fact that the premature surrender of the city will entail the destruction of the Group A in the Caucasus, which is stuck because of the fall rains and slush. Even if this motive had been correct until the end of November, but after all, now the ground was frozen and on the approaches to the Caucasus. Nevertheless, our breakthrough is forbidden even now. How can I do anything if I do not know the general situation and Manstein misinforms me? The last words sounded like a cry of despair. Paulus seemed to be crushed by the burden of responsibility placed on him. We must hope that he will endure, I thought, leaving Paulus. December 17th, late in the evening, the command of Army Group Don reported that the 17th Panzer Division joined the Army of Gotha and advancing crossed the Aksai near Generalovskoye. Let's hope, Mr. General, that now Goth will again advance, I remarked when Paulus informed me of what had happened. We are extremely interested in this. If this division 5 days earlier entered the battle, the success would be, in my opinion, would be ensured. Meanwhile, the Red Army Command had enough time to strengthen its defences. Let's see what awaits us tomorrow and the day after tomorrow. What a nerve-wracking wait. How relaxing. It affected even Major General Schmidt, who was so active. When I proposed to select from the headquarters and rear service soldiers and officers for the infantry units, although he agreed, but still preferred to wait until it will be decided on our withdrawal from the encirclement. Well, was the enemy also slow? One could hardly think so. He acted even if here his actions were reduced to a raid of one sewing machine, which at this minute streaked the sky over our command post and dropped bombs. One of them fell close to our shelter. The ground shook, window panes burst. How long would the enemy wait before delivering devastating blows to us? When would it all end, and with what? On the morning of December 18th, we were contacted by the commandant of the airfield in Pitomnik. Major Eisman, an officer of the intelligence department of Army Group Don, has just arrived. He asked to send a car for him. Immediately was sent one of the duty cars. An hour later, the major received General Paulus, followed by Major General Schmidt. Then in the shelter there was a thorough conversation between both generals and a representative of the command of the Army Group. I became acquainted with Eisman, rather superficially, during a joint lunch. He was a very young officer, clever and intelligent. That was my first impression. What was his mission here? Not a word about it was said at the table. I only heard that he was ordered to fly back to the headquarters of Army Group Don in Novocherkassk the same day. A lightning visit, I thought. Eisman wished to have another talk with Elklep and von Konowski after lunch. I, as usual, accompanied Paulus to his bunker. The commander invited me to accompany him to his office. You are probably asking yourself, Adam, what this short visit of a young officer means. Manstein instructed him to bring us up to speed on the whole situation. Gotha's army is facing a strong, numerically superior enemy. It will not be able to advance. In the opinion of the General Command of Army Group Don, it is doubtful that Gotha was able to break through the encirclement with the forces at his disposal. Manstein also believes that the possibility of increasing supply by air is excluded. Therefore, the Sixth Army must be ready to counterattack. I believe, Herr General, we are quite prepared for that. When should we move out? I find the fuel situation most serious. With its available stock of fuel, the few tanks we have will hardly go 30 kilometers in combat conditions. Meanwhile, Gotha's advanced detachments are more than 50 kilometers away from us. Did at least the command of the army group ordered that the fuel and equipment to be airlifted? Does Manstein realize the strength of our soldiers? Does he know that the majority are in a half-starved state? You yourself said that our soldiers are exhausted and that most of our divisions are located at a distance of more than 40 kilometers from the planned place of breakthrough. Remember the fate of the 94th Infantry Division, which Seidlitz pulled from the Northern Front on November 23rd. In the same way, the enemy will fall on our exhausted and battered troops and destroy them. No, under the circumstances it would be irresponsible to give the order to break through the encirclement. I must be sure that the ring of encirclement will be broken from the outside, or that Goth is so close to us that we will be able to establish communication with him within a day. Create the prerequisites for a breakthrough and set the time for the start of the breakthrough can only Manstein. So far he is still evasive in this decisive matter. I frankly stated to Eismann my point of view and asked him to equally frankly inform Manstein. After all, the situation in the cauldron in recent weeks has changed decisively. Our army can be considered combat-ready only conditionally. I do not understand why, given our catastrophic situation, Manstein sends some major instead of flying to the cauldron himself, at least to send his chief of staff. After all, our command, Herr General, needs to discuss the situation with those who have the right to make a decision, with people who here together with you could make a clear decision, so as to avoid further aggravation of the situation. You are quite right. The Army Group Command must make a decision. Manstein knows the situation inside and outside the cauldron. He knows what forces are still coming. Apparently, the commander of Army Group Don is hesitant to act against Hitler's orders at his own risk. I expected a lot from a personal conversation with Manstein in the cauldron. Here he would have to take a certain position. Schmidt, too, cannot understand why Manstein so trembling Sixth Army, and in these formidable hours sent to us the youngest officer of his staff, so we have to wait again. On my orders, Kunowski gave Eismann a written report on the catastrophic shortage of food and medical supplies. Manstein must be clear that the remnants of the Sixth Army will die most miserably if now, at the last minute, will not be outside and inside the cauldron concentrated all the forces necessary to unblock. For tens of thousands of our men, even the most decisive assistance to the Sixth Army is already too late. Nevertheless, I harbour very faint hopes that Manstein himself will decide to give the order to abandon Stalingrad. We will see, Adam, how for everything that happens here will one day be responsible for me alone. Who will take into account that orders from higher commanders have tied my hands? Who would take into account that my lack of awareness of the situation outside the boiler would paralyse me when a decision had to be made? What could I say to the near despair of Paulus, who was racking his brains day and night on how he could lead the army out of this hopeless situation? I couldn't find the words. It was clear to me that not Paulus will be considered the main culprit for the suffering of the Sixth Army, but those who sent him and his soldiers to death and then betrayed. However, who belongs among those who betrayed? Hitler, Keitel, Jodl, or the General Staff? To what extent are Weichs or Manstein guilty? Are there other culprits? At that time, I found no answer. On the evening of December 18th, as every day, the department chiefs gathered in the shelter at Paulus. Schmidt's brief report on Gotha's operation only confirmed what Eismann had relayed in the morning. The 17th and 6th Panzer Divisions were practically stuck. After that, we began to destroy our meagre dinner. The mood was depressed. Then came in the orderly and invited Paulus to the machine on the call Field Marshal von Manstein. We were wary. Has not arrived a life-saving order? Airlift said, now that would be a really fast response signal. We kept our eyes on the door. Minutes passed. Paulus did not appear. Gradually in us spoke the old scepticism. If with Manstein discussed the question of leaving the encirclement, Paulus would certainly order to call Schmidt. Well, here we are at last. The commander returned to the room, accompanied by my Oberfeldwebel-Küpper. This was strange and could have nothing to do with the order to withdraw from the encirclement. While I was pondering, Paulus approached me. I must tell you all, gentlemen, a pleasant news. Today our first Adjutant Colonel Adam for his participation in the organisation of the defence on the River Cheer. For the selflessness and courage he showed in this case, awarded the Knight's Cross. With these words, the General handed me the high award. I was so amazed that I did not immediately respond to Paulus's hearty congratulations. Everyone rushed to me, shaking hands with me. For a brief moment, hardship and death were forgotten. I was overwhelmed with great joy. I was truly proud, especially when the commander emphasized that for the first time, perhaps, in German military history, Adjutant of the Army awarded the highest order. But no sooner had I felt truly happy as this feeling faded away. The cup of joy poisoned the bitterness of memories of the battles on the Lower Cheer, accompanied by huge sacrifices. About many comrades, then and later, gave their lives. At the end of November, the Army Group Command demanded that we ensure the possibility of withdrawal of the 6th Army. For the sake of this goal, the soldiers who retreated as far as Nizhny-Chirskaya unhesitatingly took the positions indicated to them, and I perceived as my inner duty to help my comrades who were in the cauldron in such a difficult situation. For the sake of this, we were ready to give all our strength, but the sacrifices and losses were in vain. My Knight's Cross could not change anything here, but not only the sad outcome of the events of the past month, but much more the terrible reality itself, was the reason that receiving the award did not dizzy me. Late in the evening of December 18th, Schmidt brought still in the shelter officers of the headquarters of the new sad news. The Red Army continued with increasing success offensive, launched on December 16th. The front of the Italian army was finally broken through. The units of this army in panic flight left their positions and fled to the west. The Chief of Staff ended his information as follows. Thereby a wide gap has been breached on the left flank of the German divisions and combined units fighting on the Upper Cheer. The breakthrough has already reached a depth of 45 kilometres. Probably the army group will be forced to pull back the entire left flank. What will come out of Gotha's offensive? Are enough forces in his tank army to continue the offensive and quickly enter into cooperation with us? Paulus, Schmidt and I stood together in front of the operational map. It lacked a lot of data. We did not know well what our units were in the place of the breakthrough, what was their combat strength, where exactly passed the front. We literally knew nothing about what the enemy's forces were and what was the main direction of his breakthrough. The commander listened for several minutes to our suggestions, then said, "Everything depends on what reserves can and wants to introduce into the fight, the main command. We here in the cauldron, we cannot determine this. It is good if the optimists are right.